I've been hosting yard sales for over 15 years here in Millfield, California, and I thought I'd seen everything people try to sell or sneak away with. What happened on April 15, 2023, during what should have been my biggest spring sale, still makes me check my locks twice every night and question everyone who walks onto my property. My name is Jennifer, and I need to share this story because what I discovered that day wasn't just about one strange customer, it was evidence of a sophisticated criminal operation that's targeting yard sale hosts across the entire state. What started as a normal Saturday morning sale turned into a nightmare that revealed how vulnerable we all are when we open our homes to strangers. It started like any other yard sale weekend. I'd been advertising this particular sale for 3 weeks, cleaning out my late mother's house after finally settling her estate following a 2-year legal battle with my siblings. Mom had been a collector her entire life, and her house was packed with vintage dishes, antique furniture, boxes of books, jewelry, and decades worth of accumulated treasures. I'd rented tables, borrowed more from neighbors, and spent the entire previous week pricing everything and arranging displays across my front lawn on Maple Avenue. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with just enough of a breeze to make standing outside comfortable. By 6:30 a.m., serious buyers were already driving slowly past my house, scoping out what I had to offer. I'd learned over the years that the early birds were usually dealers or collectors looking for specific items, so I always tried to have my best pieces visible from the street to draw them in. By 7 a.m., I had a small crowd gathered at the end of my driveway, flashlights in hand, waiting for my official 8 o'clock start time. This was always my favorite part, seeing people's excitement as they spotted something they'd been searching for. I had everything from my mother's complete set of Depression-era glassware to her collection of vintage handbags, and I could tell from the murmurs in the crowd that this was going to be a profitable day. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I sold the dining room table to a young couple furnishing their first apartment, moved most of the books to a retired teacher who was thrilled to find several first editions, and had steady traffic browsing through everything else. My neighbor Susan came over around 9 a.m. to help me manage the crowds and handle multiple customers at once. Around 9:30, this older woman named Patricia Henderson pulled up in a pristine white sedan, one of those newer models that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. She was probably in her 70s, impeccably dressed in what looked like expensive clothes, with perfectly styled gray hair and an oversized handbag that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Everything about her screamed, "Serious collector with money to spend." Patricia browsed quietly for about 20 minutes, examining my mother's china collection with what seemed like genuine expertise. She knew the right questions to ask about patterns and manufacturers, handled the pieces carefully, and spoke knowledgeably about the history of certain designs. This wasn't unusual. I get serious collectors all the time who can spot valuable pieces from across the yard. What caught my attention was the pet carrier she'd left in her back seat. Through the tinted windows, I could see what looked like a small gray and white cat. It wasn't moving much, just sitting perfectly still in an upright position, which I assumed meant it was probably sleeping or exceptionally well trained. I'm a cat person myself, so I always notice when customers bring their pets along. Patricia noticed me looking toward her car and smiled warmly. "That's Whiskers," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that I attributed to her age. "He's been with me for 3 years now. Never causes any trouble at all. He's very well behaved, doesn't even meow during car rides." I nodded politely and commented about how nice it was that she could bring him along. She seemed pleased by the interaction and mentioned that Whiskers was getting older and didn't like being left alone anymore. It was the kind of conversation you have with fellow pet owners, nothing that raised any red flags. Patricia spent another 10 minutes examining items, asking detailed questions about provenance and condition. She purchased a few small pieces, some costume jewelry that had belonged to my mother, a decorative ceramic bowl, and an ornate picture frame. She paid in exact change, counting out bills and coins with the precision of someone who'd calculated her purchases carefully. The total came to $23.50, and she had the money ready down to the last quarter. As she was preparing to leave, Patricia asked if I had any more jewelry or small valuables that hadn't been put out yet. This was a common question from serious buyers, so I mentioned that I had a few more boxes in the house that I hadn't gone through completely. She seemed very interested and asked if she could come back later in the day to see what else I might have available. "I collect vintage brooches specifically," she explained. "My mother had a similar collection, and I'm always looking for pieces that remind me of hers." I told her I'd be here until 4 p.m. and that she was welcome to return. She thanked me, gathered her purchases, and walked back to her car. I watched her carefully place Whisker's carrier on the passenger seat before driving away slowly, the careful driving of someone who's protective of their pet. Here's where things started getting strange. About 10 minutes after Patricia left, I was reorganizing a table of books that had been picked through when I heard this odd whirring sound coming from inside my house. It was subtle but persistent, like a small motor or mechanical device running continuously. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of my kitchen. My first thought was that my refrigerator was acting up again. It had been making weird noises for the past month, and I'd been putting off calling for a repair. But this sound was different, more purposeful somehow, like machinery operating rather than an appliance malfunctioning. I asked Susan to watch the tables and went inside to investigate. My back door was propped open for easy access during the sale, which I always did to make it convenient to grab drinks, use the bathroom, or retrieve additional items from storage. The sound was definitely coming from my kitchen, and it was getting slightly louder as I approached. That's when I saw it, and my blood ran cold. Sitting on my kitchen counter, positioned perfectly in the center like it had been deliberately placed there, was a small gray and white cat identical to the one I'd seen in Patricia's car. It was sitting in an unnaturally perfect posture, completely motionless, staring straight ahead with these bright blue eyes that seemed to glow with an internal light source. My immediate reaction was confusion mixed with concern. Had Patricia's cat somehow gotten out of her car and wandered into my house? But that didn't make sense. I'd watched her drive away with the carrier on her passenger seat. And how would a cat have gotten onto my counter? My kitchen counter is nearly 4 feet high, and there weren't any chairs or obvious climbing paths nearby. As I got closer, every instinct I had started screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The cat wasn't breathing, not the slow, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping animal, or even the quick, alert breathing of a cat in a strange environment. Its fur looked too perfect, too uniform in color and texture. Real cats have variations in their coat, little irregularities and natural patterns. This looked like it had been manufactured. But what really disturbed me were those eyes. They weren't moving or blinking like a real animal's would. They maintained the same fixed stare, and in the morning light streaming through my kitchen window, I could swear I saw a faint mechanical glow behind them, like LED lights or camera lenses. I approached slowly, talking softly the way you do with an unfamiliar animal, but there was no response at all. No ear movement, no acknowledgement of my presence, no natural feline curiosity. It just continued staring ahead with that same unsettling, artificial focus. When I finally worked up the courage to reach out and touch it, I felt my heart start racing. Instead of warm fur and the soft resistance of a living body, I felt something that vibrated with internal mechanical activity. The fur felt synthetic, convincing from a distance, but obviously artificial up close. And underneath, I could feel solid components, like circuit boards and motors, rather than the bones and muscles of a real animal. The whirring sound I'd been hearing was coming directly from this thing. As I examined it more closely, I could see tiny details that no real cat would have. Along the edges of its ears were what looked like small antennae or sensor arrays. The pupils of its eyes weren't the natural slits of a feline but perfectly round apertures that looked exactly like camera lenses. With my hand shaking, I picked it up to examine it more thoroughly. It was significantly heavier than a real cat of that size would be, probably 15 or 20 pounds of solid electronics packed into a cat-shaped shell. I could feel mechanical components shifting and adjusting inside as I moved it, like a complex piece of machinery recalibrating itself. Running my fingers along its body, I found what I was looking for: a seam in the synthetic fur along the bottom where the shell could be opened. There was a small panel with what appeared to be a USB port, some kind of serial number, and several tiny buttons that looked like they controlled different functions. The whirring sound suddenly intensified, and I nearly dropped the device when a small compartment in its chest area popped open with a soft clicking sound. Inside was sophisticated electronics, a tiny high-definition camera, what appeared to be multiple data storage devices, and several components I couldn't immediately identify but which looked expensive and professionally manufactured. This wasn't just a robot designed to look like a cat, it was a sophisticated surveillance device that had been actively recording everything in my house. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This thing had been in my kitchen, with a clear view of my entire main floor, recording my daily routines, my security measures, my personal conversations, and probably mapping the layout of my home for God knows how long. I immediately carried the device outside and called 911. The dispatcher initially seemed confused by my report. "Ma'am, you're saying you found a robot cat in your kitchen?" But I insisted on police response. I described it as a possible burglary tool or surveillance device, which got their attention much faster. Officer Martinez arrived within 15 minutes, and I could tell he was skeptical until he saw the device himself. When I showed him the open compartment with the camera and electronics, his entire demeanor changed. He called for his supervisor immediately and asked me to provide a detailed account of everything that had happened that morning. "This is way beyond my expertise," Officer Martinez admitted as he carefully photographed the device from multiple angles. "We need to get the tech crimes unit involved. This looks like some serious professional equipment." Detective Williams from the Tech Crimes Unit arrived about an hour later with a specialist from the county sheriff's Digital Forensics Division. She'd apparently encountered similar devices before in other cases. They spent nearly 2 hours examining the robot cat, downloading data from its storage systems, and dusting it for fingerprints. "This is extremely sophisticated equipment," Detective Williams explained as her team worked. "Street value is probably around $4,000, maybe more. The camera system alone is military-grade technology. Whoever is manufacturing these isn't some amateur operation, they're professionals with serious technical resources and significant financial backing." The forensics specialist was able to access the device's memory and show me exactly what it had been recording. The footage was crystal clear, showing detailed views of my kitchen, living room, and front hallway. It had captured audio of my conversations with customers, recorded my security system's beeping patterns when I set and disarmed it, and even documented my daily routines over what appeared to be several days. "Look at this timestamp," the specialist pointed out. "This device has been active and recording for almost 2 weeks. This wasn't Patricia's first visit to your property." That revelation sent chills down my spine. Detective Williams ran Patricia Henderson's license plate, but it came back as stolen from a vehicle reported missing 3 days earlier in Sacramento. The registration information she'd provided was completely fabricated. The investigation quickly expanded as Detective Williams contacted other homeowners who'd hosted yard sales recently. Out of 12 families she spoke with, 4 had been burglarized within the past 2 months, and all remembered an older woman matching Patricia's description. "The pattern is consistent," Detective Williams explained. "They plant surveillance devices during yard sales when homeowners are distracted. The devices record everything for weeks' daily schedules, security measures, valuable items. Then they plan carefully targeted burglaries when homes are empty." What really terrified me was discovering that my house had been on their target list for a major break-in scheduled for the following weekend, when I was supposed to visit my daughter in Oregon. The device had captured detailed audio of my travel plans, footage of my security code entry, and recordings of me discussing where I kept important documents and jewelry. Margaret Foster, Patricia's real name, was arrested 3 weeks later when she attempted to plant another device at an estate sale in Fresno. She was part of a sophisticated theft ring that had stolen over $400,000 worth of items from homes across 3 states over 18 months. The robot cats were custom manufactured by a former Silicon Valley engineer recruited by the criminal organization. Each device cost nearly $5,000 to produce, but they enabled thefts worth tens of thousands from each targeted home. During Margaret's trial, I learned my house had been prioritized for a coordinated break-in involving 3 people who would have had detailed floor plans, security system information, and complete inventory of valuable items. They'd identified over $30,000 worth of items they planned to steal. The whole experience fundamentally changed how I approach yard sales and home security. I've installed additional cameras, implemented a more sophisticated security system, and I'm extremely careful about who I allow inside during sales. But what really disturbs me is how normal and trustworthy Margaret seemed, exactly like any other serious collector. Here's what I want to know from anyone watching this. Have you ever noticed anything strange during yard sales you've hosted? Any customers who seemed overly interested in your house layout, asked too many personal questions, or small items that went missing? Have you ever had the feeling someone was watching your house or had been inside when you weren't home? Because what I discovered was just the beginning of something much bigger happening across the country. 3 days after the robot cat incident made local news, I got a call from Detective Williams asking if I'd be willing to help with another case. Apparently, word had spread through the yard sale community about what happened at my place, and she'd received a disturbing report from someone who claimed to have information about similar surveillance activities. What I discovered when I agreed to help still makes me question how well we really know the people in our own neighborhoods. The call came from a woman named Rebecca Torres, who lived about 20 minutes away in Bakersfield on Pine Ridge Drive. She'd been hosting yard sales for over a decade and had built up a reputation in the collector community for finding rare and valuable items. Rebecca claimed she'd been documenting suspicious customers for months and had evidence of an organized network targeting yard sale hosts throughout the Central Valley. Detective Williams asked if I'd accompany her to Rebecca's house, partly because my recent experience might help identify similar patterns, and partly because Rebecca had specifically requested to speak with me. She'd read about my case in the local newspaper and insisted that what happened to me was connected to something much larger she'd been investigating on her own. When we arrived at Rebecca's address on the morning of April 18th, I immediately noticed something unusual about her property. The front yard was immaculate, perfectly manicured lawn, precisely trimmed hedges, and not a single leaf out of place. But what caught my attention were the security cameras. There had to be at least 8 visible cameras covering every angle of the property, which seemed excessive even for someone concerned about safety. Rebecca answered the door before we could knock, as if she'd been watching for our arrival. She was a woman in her mid-50s, thin and nervous-looking, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her clothes were clean but worn, and she kept glancing over our shoulders as if expecting someone else to appear. "Thank God you're here," she said, ushering us inside quickly. "I've been waiting for someone to take this seriously. What I've discovered is going to shock you." The interior of Rebecca's house was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Every available surface was covered with meticulously organized documentation, photographs, spreadsheets, charts, and what appeared to be surveillance footage printed out and arranged in chronological order. The living room had been converted into what looked like a command center, with multiple computer monitors, filing cabinets, and cork boards covered with strings connecting various pieces of information. "I know this looks crazy," Rebecca said, noticing our expressions, "but I've been tracking patterns in yard sale crimes for the past 18 months, ever since my neighbor Mrs. Patterson was robbed after hosting an estate sale. The police said it was random, but I knew better." Detective Williams pulled out her notebook and began asking questions, but Rebecca was already moving around the room, pulling out folders and pointing to different displays. Her energy was manic, almost frantic, as she tried to show us everything at once. "Look at this," she said, spreading photographs across her coffee table. "These are pictures I've taken of suspicious customers at yard sales throughout Kern County. Same people, different names, always paying cash, always asking detailed questions about security systems and travel plans." The photographs were surprisingly detailed and professionally composed. Rebecca had apparently been using telephoto lenses to capture images of people at yard sales from considerable distances. Some of the photos showed license plates, others focused on faces, and several captured people examining items or talking to homeowners. "This woman here," Rebecca pointed to a photo of an elderly woman with gray hair. She calls herself different names at different sales. Patricia Henderson, Margaret Foster, sometimes Dorothy Williams. I've documented her at 17 different sales over the past year. I felt my blood run cold as I recognized the woman from my own yard sale. It was definitely the same person who'd planted the robot cat in my kitchen, but seeing her in multiple contexts across different locations made the scope of the operation much more real and frightening. How did you manage to photograph all these people without them noticing? Detective Williams asked, clearly impressed but also concerned about the extent of Rebecca's surveillance activities. I set up observation posts, Rebecca explained, leading us to one of her computer monitors. I attend yard sales as a customer, but I also position myself strategically to document suspicious behavior. I've invested in professional photography equipment and surveillance software to track patterns. She pulled up what appeared to be a database on her computer, with hundreds of entries containing names, dates, locations, and detailed behavioral observations. Each entry included photographs, license plate numbers, and notes about what items the subjects had purchased or shown interest in. The thing is, Rebecca continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, I think some of these people know I'm watching them. And I think they're starting to watch me back. That's when she showed us the really disturbing evidence. Rebecca had been receiving anonymous packages at her house over the past month, small boxes with no return address containing items that had been sold at yard sales she'd attended. A vintage brooch here, a decorative bowl there, always things that legitimate customers had purchased in front of her. Someone is buying items at yard sales and then sending them to me, she explained. It's like they're taunting me, showing me they know I'm documenting their activities. But here's the scary part, some of these items were purchased by people I never photographed or identified as suspicious. Detective Williams examined the packages and their contents carefully. The items themselves were unremarkable, but the fact that someone was tracking Rebecca's movements and purchases was deeply concerning. It suggested that her surveillance activities had been detected and that she was now being targeted by the same criminal network. Rebecca, I said gently, when did you first start noticing these patterns? What made you begin documenting all of this? Her expression changed, becoming more guarded and intense. It started after my sister was murdered, she said quietly. The police said it was a burglary gone wrong, but I knew the people who killed her had been to her yard sale the week before. I started paying attention after that, and I realized how vulnerable we all are. Detective Williams and I exchanged glances. This was clearly a woman who had been traumatized by her sister's death and had become obsessed with preventing similar crimes. But the question was whether her documentation was accurate and helpful, or whether her grief had led her to see patterns that didn't actually exist. Can you show us the evidence about your sister's case? Detective Williams asked. Rebecca led us to another section of her living room where she had assembled what appeared to be a complete investigation file. Crime scene photos, police reports, witness statements, and her own analysis of the evidence. It was clear she'd spent hundreds of hours researching every detail of her sister's murder. Linda lived in Visalia on Elm Street, Rebecca explained. She hosted a big estate sale on June 12, 2022, selling off our parents' belongings after they passed. The sale was advertised in multiple newspapers and online, drew huge crowds over 2 days. Exactly 1 week later, she was found dead in her house, and valuable items worth over $50,000 were missing. The police reports showed that Linda Torres had indeed been murdered during what appeared to be a home invasion. The perpetrators had detailed knowledge of where valuable items were stored, had disabled her security system expertly, and had avoided leaving any useful forensic evidence. It was a professional operation, not a random crime. The police never connected it to the yard sale. Rebecca continued. But I remembered several customers who had asked Linda very specific questions about when she'd be traveling, whether she lived alone, and details about her daily routine. I started attending other yard sales in the area to see if I could spot the same people. What Rebecca had discovered over the following months was legitimately disturbing. She documented what appeared to be an organized network of individuals who attended yard sales and estate sales throughout the Central Valley, asking similar questions and showing interest in the same types of high-value items. The problem is, Detective Williams said carefully, some of what you're showing us looks like normal yard sale behavior. People ask questions about items, they're curious about travel plans when they're trying to negotiate prices, and serious collectors do tend to show up at multiple sales. Rebecca's response was immediate and emotional. That's exactly what the police said about Linda's case. They said it was just a coincidence that criminals target houses after estate sales all the time. But I've documented dozens of cases where the same people attended sales and the houses were robbed within days or weeks. She pulled out another folder containing newspaper clippings and police reports from burglaries throughout Kern, Tulare, and Fresno counties. Her documentation showed a clear pattern of homes being burglarized after hosting large yard sales or estate sales, often with inside knowledge of security measures and valuable item locations. The thing that really convinced me, Rebecca said, was when I started recognizing specific techniques. These people don't just attend sales randomly, they work in teams. One person distracts the homeowner with detailed questions while another plants surveillance devices or takes photographs of security systems. They coordinate their activities using hand signals and cell phone calls. She showed us photographs she'd taken of people at yard sales appearing to communicate with each other across different areas of properties. In several images, she'd captured what did appear to be coordinated behavior, people positioning themselves strategically and using gestures that could be interpreted as signals. But as Detective Williams continued examining Rebecca's evidence, I started noticing some troubling inconsistencies. Some of her suspicious photographs showed people engaged in completely normal yard sale activities. Her interpretations of body language and behavior sometimes seemed to be influenced more by her suspicions than by objective observation. Rebecca, Detective Williams said gently, I need to ask you something important. Have you been entering private property to take some of these photographs? Some of these angles suggest you were closer to people's houses than would be normal for a yard sale customer. Rebecca's demeanor suddenly shifted, becoming defensive and agitated. I do whatever is necessary to protect people, she said. The police won't investigate properly, so someone has to document what's really happening. If that means getting close enough to capture useful evidence, then that's what I do. It became clear that Rebecca had been conducting surveillance activities that went far beyond normal yard sale attendance. She'd been following suspicious individuals to their vehicles, photographing license plates from private property, and in some cases, positioning herself on adjacent properties to get better camera angles. I've even followed some of these people to other locations, she admitted. I've documented several of them meeting at specific locations after yard sales, presumably to plan their burglaries. I have photographs of them exchanging information and what appears to be surveillance equipment. Detective Williams closed her notebook and looked at Rebecca seriously. What you're describing sounds like stalking. Following people, photographing them without consent, trespassing on private property, these are serious crimes, regardless of your motivations. Rebecca became increasingly agitated. You're just like the other police officers. You don't understand the scope of what's happening here. These people killed my sister, and they're going to kill other innocent homeowners unless someone stops them. I'm the only one who's been taking this seriously. The situation was becoming uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Rebecca was clearly suffering from paranoia and obsessive behavior related to her sister's death. While some of her documentation might be legitimate, her methods and interpretations were compromised by her psychological state. I need you to understand something, Rebecca continued, her voice rising. They know I'm onto them. That's why they're sending me those packages, why they're watching my house. I've had to install all these security cameras because I'm being targeted. Someone broke into my house last month, but nothing was stolen, they just wanted me to know they could get in. Detective Williams asked to see the police report from the break-in, but Rebecca admitted she hadn't reported it. She claimed the police wouldn't take her seriously, and that reporting the incident would only put her in more danger. As we prepared to leave, Rebecca became desperate for us to believe her. "Please," she said, grabbing Detective Williams' arm. "Just because I'm emotional about this doesn't mean I'm wrong. My sister is dead because these people are allowed to operate freely. Don't let them kill someone else." During the drive back to the station, Detective Williams and I discussed what we'd observed. While Rebecca had clearly documented some legitimate suspicious behavior, her methods were problematic and her mental state was concerning. The challenge was separating potentially useful information from paranoid delusions. "The tragedy is that she might actually have some valuable intelligence," Detective Williams said. "But her credibility is compromised by her illegal surveillance activities and obsessive behavior. We can't use evidence obtained through stalking and trespassing." 2 weeks later, Detective Williams called to tell me that Rebecca Torres had been arrested for stalking and harassment. Apparently, she'd been following and photographing an elderly woman who collected vintage jewelry at yard sales, convinced that the woman was part of the criminal network. The victim was actually a retired teacher who attended estate sales as a hobby and had become terrified of Rebecca's increasingly aggressive surveillance. The sad reality was that Rebecca's grief over her sister's murder had driven her to become the very type of threatening person she thought she was protecting others from. Her obsession with preventing crime had led her to commit crimes herself. But the most disturbing part was that some of Rebecca's documentation did appear to be legitimate. Detective Williams found enough credible evidence in her files to launch an investigation into several suspicious individuals who had been attending yard sales throughout the region. Rebecca's paranoia had corrupted her credibility, but underneath the obsession was real criminal activity that needed to be addressed. The case made me realize how thin the line can be between vigilance and paranoia, between protecting yourself and becoming a threat to others. Rebecca had started with legitimate concerns about her sister's death, but her grief and fear had twisted into something dangerous and destructive. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you at a yard sale or other public event? Have you noticed the same people showing up repeatedly at sales in your area? Most importantly, if you have legitimate safety concerns, how do you pursue them without crossing the line into obsessive or illegal behavior? Because what I learned from Rebecca's story is that sometimes the people trying to protect us can become just as dangerous as the criminals they're hunting. 2 weeks after visiting Rebecca Torres, Detective Williams contacted me again with a request that seemed strange at first. She'd received reports of unusual yard sale activity happening during weekdays and winter throughout the region's sales that violated typical community patterns and seemed to be attracting the same group of buyers repeatedly. She wanted me to attend one of these sales as an observer, since my experience with surveillance devices might help identify suspicious behavior. The specific sale she wanted me to monitor was scheduled for Wednesday, January 24, 2024, at a house on Hickory Lane in Stockton. What made this sale unusual wasn't just the timing. Most legitimate yard sales happen on weekends when working people can attend, but the fact that it was being held in the middle of winter when most families are focused on post-holiday cleanup rather than acquiring more items. "The homeowner is a man named Craig Patterson," Detective Williams explained during our briefing. "He's hosted 3 sales in the past 2 months, always on weekdays, always advertised only in specific online forums rather than general classified ads. The same group of buyers shows up at each sale, and neighbors have reported strange activity at the house during non-sale hours." What really caught law enforcement's attention was that Craig Patterson had no apparent source for the merchandise he was selling. Neighbors reported that he rarely left his house except for these sales, yet his yard was consistently filled with expensive electronics, tools, jewelry, and collectibles that seemed too valuable for a typical homeowner's possessions. I arrived at the address on Hickory Lane around 9 a.m., an hour before the advertised start time. The neighborhood was typical suburban modest single-story houses built in the 1970s, mature trees and quiet streets where most residents had already left for work. Craig's house stood out immediately because of the sheer volume of merchandise arranged in his driveway and front yard. Tables were covered with power tools that looked barely used, boxes of expensive electronics still in original packaging, and displays of jewelry and watches that seemed far too valuable for a casual yard sale. Everything was organized with professional precision, priced clearly, and arranged to showcase the most valuable items prominently. Craig Patterson himself was in his early 40s, medium height with thinning brown hair and nervous mannerisms. He kept checking his phone constantly and glancing up and down the street as if expecting specific arrivals. When I approached to browse his merchandise, he seemed anxious about my presence. "Are you here for anything specific?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Most of my regular customers know exactly what they're looking for." I explained that I was just browsing, interested in electronics and tools for my husband. Craig relaxed slightly but continued to watch me carefully as I examined items. The merchandise was definitely high-quality professional-grade power tools, designer jewelry, expensive smartphones and tablets, and collectibles that would typically sell for hundreds of dollars each. Around 10:15, the regular customers Craig had mentioned began arriving. What struck me immediately was how different they were from typical yard sale shoppers. These were well-dressed individuals driving expensive vehicles, and they approached Craig's sale with the efficiency of people conducting business transactions rather than casual browsing. The first arrival was a woman in her 50s named Sandra Kim, driving a new BMW. She walked directly to a table of electronics, examined several tablets and smartphones with the expertise of someone who knew exactly what to look for, and selected 3 items without any price negotiation. She paid Craig in cash over $600 and left within 10 minutes. The second customer was a man named Robert Chin, probably in his 30s, who arrived in a commercial van. He went straight to the tool displays and began selecting items with professional knowledge, asking Craig technical questions about specifications and condition. Within 15 minutes, he'd purchased nearly $2,000 worth of power tools and automotive equipment. What made these transactions suspicious wasn't just the speed and efficiency, but the complete lack of typical yard sale interaction. No browsing, no casual conversation, no attempts to negotiate prices. These people knew exactly what Craig had available, and what they were willing to pay for it. I continued observing while pretending to shop, taking mental notes of license plates and customer behavior. Over the next hour, 6 more individuals arrived and conducted similar efficient transactions. Each person seemed to specialize in specific types of merchandise, electronics, tools, jewelry, or collectibles, and each made substantial cash purchases without hesitation. Around 11:30, something happened that made the true nature of this operation clear. A nervous-looking teenager arrived on foot, carrying a backpack and looking around anxiously before approaching Craig. Instead of browsing the displayed merchandise, he spoke quietly with Craig for several minutes before pulling items from his backpack: expensive smartphones, designer watches, and what appeared to be high-end electronics. Craig examined each item carefully, checking serial numbers and testing functionality, before negotiating prices with the teenager. The conversation was quiet but clearly business-focused, with Craig ultimately paying the young man cash for items that were obviously stolen. The teenager left quickly, and Craig immediately added the new merchandise to his existing displays. I realized I was witnessing a sophisticated fencing operation disguised as a yard sale. Craig Patterson wasn't selling his personal belongings, he was operating as a middleman between thieves and buyers, using the legitimate cover of a yard sale to conduct illegal transactions. The weekday timing and limited advertising ensured that only his network of criminal contacts would attend. Deciding I needed to document what I was seeing, I began taking discreet photographs with my phone while pretending to browse. But as I was photographing a table of electronics, I noticed Craig watching me intently. His nervous demeanor had shifted to something more alert and potentially threatening. "Excuse me," Craig said, approaching me directly. "I don't think you're here to shop. You've been taking pictures and watching my customers for over an hour without buying anything." I tried to maintain my cover story about shopping for my husband, but Craig wasn't convinced. "I think you need to leave," he said firmly. "This is private property, and you're making my customers uncomfortable." Several of the customers had stopped their transactions and were now watching our interaction. I realized that staying longer could become dangerous, so I apologized and began walking toward my car. But as I left, I heard Craig making phone calls, presumably alerting his network that law enforcement might be monitoring their activities. I drove to a nearby convenience store and immediately called Detective Williams to report what I'd observed. She instructed me to stay in the area but maintain distance while she arranged for surveillance units to monitor the location. "What you're describing sounds like a classic fencing operation," Detective Williams said. "Using yard sales as cover is actually brilliant. It provides legitimate explanation for people bringing and purchasing large quantities of merchandise, and the cash transactions don't trigger banking regulations." Within 2 hours, Detective Williams arrived with additional officers and a search warrant for Craig Patterson's property. The search revealed evidence that confirmed my observations. The house was being used as a distribution center for stolen goods, with sophisticated inventory tracking systems and communication equipment for coordinating with thieves and buyers throughout the region. Craig's operation was more extensive than anyone had realized. He'd been running similar fake yard sales at different locations throughout the Central Valley, always on weekdays when law enforcement attention was lower and legitimate customers were less likely to stumble upon the activities. His network included car thieves, burglars, shoplifters, and organized retail theft rings who used his sales to convert stolen merchandise into cash. The investigation revealed that Craig's fake yard sales were connected to the same criminal organization behind the robot cat surveillance devices. The stolen merchandise being sold at his sales often came from homes that had been burglarized after being surveilled during legitimate yard sales and estate sales. This is why they needed the surveillance operation, Detective Williams explained during the follow-up briefing. They weren't just stealing random items, they were targeting specific valuable merchandise that they knew they could move quickly through Craig's network. The robot cats helped them identify exactly what to steal and where to find it. Craig Patterson was arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to receiving stolen property, operating a criminal enterprise, and money laundering. During his interrogation, he revealed the scope of the network: over 40 individuals involved in theft, transportation, and sales of stolen goods across 3 states. The bust at Craig's operation led to the recovery of stolen merchandise worth over $300,000 and the identification of dozens of victims who had been burglarized over the past year. Many of the items had been stolen from homes that had recently hosted yard sales or estate sales. But what really disturbed me about Craig's operation was how normal it appeared from the outside. To casual observers, it looked like a regular yard sale with enthusiastic customers who appreciated quality merchandise. The criminal activity was hidden behind a facade of legitimate commerce that most people would never question. The timing of these sales was particularly insidious. By conducting business on weekday mornings, Craig's operation avoided scrutiny from working families who might notice unusual activity in their neighborhoods. Most neighbors assumed he was just a retiree or someone with a flexible schedule who enjoyed hosting sales. The case also revealed how vulnerable our communities are to organized criminal activity that hides behind familiar, trusted activities. Yard sales are such a normal part of suburban life that most people never question unusual patterns or suspicious behavior at these events. Detective Williams told me that law enforcement agencies across the country have started paying more attention to yard sale patterns as potential indicators of criminal activity. Fake sales being used for drug distribution, money laundering, and stolen goods trafficking have become increasingly common as criminals adapt to increased scrutiny of traditional illegal activities. The winter timing of Craig's sales was particularly significant because it violated normal seasonal patterns. Legitimate yard sales typically happen during warmer months when people are doing spring cleaning or preparing for moves. Sales conducted during winter months, especially on weekdays, often indicate commercial rather than personal motivations. 6 months later, the entire criminal network was dismantled through coordinated arrests across California, Nevada, and Arizona. Over 200 people were charged with various crimes, and millions of dollars worth of stolen property was recovered. But the investigation revealed that similar networks are operating in communities throughout the country. Here's what I want to know from anyone watching this. Have you noticed yard sales happening at unusual times in your neighborhood weekdays, winter months, or repeated sales at the same location? Have you seen the same buyers attending multiple sales with large amounts of cash? Do you know neighbors who seem to have yard sales regularly but never seem to run out of valuable merchandise to sell? Because what I discovered was that criminals are using the trust and familiarity of yard sales to hide sophisticated illegal operations right in our own neighborhoods. The final piece of this nightmare puzzle fell into place 6 weeks after Craig Patterson's arrest, when Detective Williams received an anonymous tip that would reveal the true scope of the criminal network we'd been investigating. The caller claimed to have information about basement sales happening in residential neighborhoods, illegal markets hidden beneath the cover of normal suburban homes where the most valuable stolen merchandise was being sold to high-end buyers. "We need to end this," Detective Williams told me during our phone call on March 8, 2024. "The tip came from someone who claims to have attended one of these basement operations. They're willing to cooperate, but only if you're present during the interview. Apparently, your involvement in exposing the other parts of this network has given you credibility with people who've been afraid to come forward." The informant was a woman named Michelle Rodriguez who lived in Riverside on Cedar Falls Drive. She'd agreed to meet us at the police station, but when she arrived, I could see she was terrified. Michelle was in her mid-30s, well-dressed, and clearly educated, but she kept looking over her shoulder and speaking in whispers even though we were in a secure interview room. "I need to tell you what I saw," Michelle began, her hands shaking as she spoke. "But you have to understand, these people know where I live, they know my family. If they find out I talk to police, I don't know what they'll do to us." Michelle explained that she'd been attending yard sales and estate sales as a hobby for several years, looking for vintage furniture and home decor items. She'd developed a reputation among certain sellers as someone willing to pay good prices for quality pieces, which led to her being invited to exclusive private sales. "About 8 months ago, I was at an estate sale in Fresno when this woman approached me," Michelle continued. "She said she had access to much higher quality merchandise than what was available at public sales, and she invited me to a private showing. She gave me an address and told me to come on a specific Saturday evening." The address led Michelle to a modest ranch-style house in a quiet residential neighborhood in Clovis on Sycamore Road. The homeowner, a man named David Henderson, greeted her at the front door and explained that he specialized in acquiring estate pieces before they went to public auction. "The main floor of the house looked completely normal," Michelle said. "Nice furniture, family photos, everything you'd expect in a regular home. But then David led me downstairs to what he called his private showroom. What Michelle found in David Henderson's basement was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The entire space had been converted into a professional retail environment with proper lighting, security displays, and merchandise organized by category and value. There were vintage jewelry collections worth tens of thousands of dollars, antique furniture pieces, rare artwork, and collectibles that belonged in museums rather than private homes. The quality was incredible," Michelle admitted. "Things I'd only seen in high-end auction houses or exclusive galleries. The prices were reasonable, maybe 60% of what you'd pay at legitimate dealers. I thought I'd discovered some kind of insider network for serious collectors." Over the following months, Michelle attended several of these basement sales, always by invitation only and always conducted with strict secrecy. David would contact her by phone when new merchandise became available, giving her specific times to visit and warning her never to discuss the sales with anyone else. "There were usually 4 or 5 other customers at these events," Michelle continued. "All serious collectors with substantial money to spend. We'd browse the basement showroom for an hour or two, make our purchases, and leave discreetly. David insisted on cash payments, and never provided receipts or documentation for the sales." What gradually made Michelle suspicious was the rapid turnover of merchandise, and the inconsistent stories about where items were acquired. David claimed to have connections with estate attorneys and auction houses, but the same types of high-value pieces appeared week after week, which seemed impossible if they were legitimately sourced. "The final straw was when I recognized a specific piece," Michelle said, her voice dropping even lower. "A Victorian jewelry collection that I'd seen at an estate sale in Bakersfield just 2 weeks earlier. The family had decided not to sell it at the public sale, keeping it for sentimental reasons. But there it was in David's basement, priced for immediate sale. Michelle realized she'd been participating in a sophisticated fencing operation that specialized in high-end stolen goods. The basement sales were designed to attract affluent buyers who could afford expensive items and who valued discretion over documentation. The residential setting and invitation-only format made the operation nearly invisible to law enforcement. I stopped attending the sales immediately, Michelle explained. But I was terrified about what I'd already purchased. I realized I'd unknowingly bought stolen property worth tens of thousands of dollars. I didn't know whether to contact police or just try to distance myself from the whole thing. Detective Williams asked Michelle to describe David Henderson's operation in detail. The basement showroom was professionally organized with proper security measures, inventory tracking systems, and what appeared to be authentication equipment for verifying the value of high-end items. David had relationships with several other similar operations, Michelle revealed. He'd sometimes mention that certain pieces were available at sister locations if customers were interested. It sounded like there was a whole network of these basement sales happening throughout the Central Valley. What made David's operation particularly sophisticated was its target market. Rather than trying to move stolen goods quickly through pawn shops or online sales, he was catering to wealthy collectors who appreciated quality and were willing to pay substantial prices for exclusive access to rare items. The customers weren't criminals, Michelle emphasized. They were doctors, lawyers, business owners, people who had money to spend on their hobbies and who valued the personal service and discretion that David provided. Most of them probably had no idea they were buying stolen property. Detective Williams arranged for Michelle to participate in a controlled operation to gather evidence against David Henderson. She would attend one more basement sale wearing recording equipment and accompanied by undercover officers posing as potential buyers. The operation took place on March 15, 2024, at David's house on Sycamore Road. I wasn't directly involved, but Detective Williams briefed me on what they discovered. David's basement contained stolen merchandise worth over $500,000, including items that had been taken during the burglaries connected to the Robot Cat surveillance operation. This was the end point of the entire criminal network, Detective Williams explained. Thieves would use surveillance devices to identify valuable items in homes, steal specific pieces during targeted burglaries, and deliver them to David's operation for sale to high-end buyers. It was a complete supply chain from surveillance to final sale. David Henderson's basement also contained detailed records of his transactions, customer lists, and connections to similar operations in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and Phoenix. The investigation revealed a multi-state network of basement showrooms catering to wealthy buyers who wanted access to exclusive merchandise without asking uncomfortable questions about provenance. During the raid, police discovered that David's operation was directly connected to Margaret Foster's surveillance activities and Craig Patterson's fencing network. The Robot Cats identified valuable items, the weekday yard sales provided cover for moving stolen goods quickly, and the basement showrooms generated maximum profit from the most valuable pieces. What's particularly disturbing, Detective Williams said, is how the operation exploited people's trust and social connections. Michelle and the other customers weren't criminals, they were manipulated into participating in illegal activities through carefully constructed social engineering. David Henderson was arrested and charged with operating a criminal enterprise, receiving stolen property, and money laundering. His customer records led to the recovery of additional stolen items and helped identify victims of burglaries throughout the region. But the investigation also revealed the vulnerability of affluent collectors to this type of manipulation. Many of David's customers had purchased stolen property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, believing they were participating in an exclusive legitimate market. Several faced civil forfeiture of their collections and potential criminal charges. The basement showroom concept was particularly insidious because it exploited psychological factors that made buyers less likely to question the legitimacy of transactions. The residential setting created a false sense of security, the invitation-only format made customers feel special and trusted, and the high quality of merchandise seemed to validate the operation's legitimacy. Michelle's cooperation was crucial to dismantling the network, but she faced significant personal consequences for her involvement. Although she avoided criminal charges by cooperating with the investigation, she lost over $40,000 worth of items that were returned to their rightful owners, and she lived in fear of retaliation from other network members. The final arrests in this case occurred over the course of 6 months, with over 80 people charged across 4 states. The total value of recovered stolen property exceeded $3 million, and the investigation revealed criminal activities dating back over 3 years. But what haunts me most about this case is how the network exploited ordinary activities that should be safe and enjoyable. Yard sales, estate sales, and collector communities are supposed to bring people together around shared interests. These criminals turn those social connections into weapons for manipulation and theft. The basement sales represented the final betrayal of trust in this network. Affluent collectors thought they were participating in an exclusive community of fellow enthusiasts, but they were actually funding organized crime that victimized families throughout the region. 6 months after the network was dismantled, I still get calls from Detective Williams about similar operations being discovered in other states. The combination of surveillance technology, social engineering, and legitimate business facades makes these networks extremely difficult to detect and investigate. Here's what I need everyone watching this to understand. The criminals who targeted our communities weren't outsiders or obviously dangerous people. They were neighbors, customers, and business associates who used our trust and social connections against us. They turned yard sales from community gatherings into hunting grounds for victims. Have you ever been invited to exclusive sales or private showings that seemed too good to be true? Have you purchased valuable items without proper documentation because the seller seemed trustworthy? Do you know people in your community who always seem to have access to high-end merchandise at unusually low prices? Because what I learned from this investigation is that criminals are using our desire for good deals and exclusive access to fund organized crime operations that destroy families and communities. The scariest part isn't the technology or the sophistication of these networks, it's how easily they manipulated ordinary people into participating in activities that seemed completely normal but were actually criminal enterprises. None of us are immune to this type of manipulation, and that's what makes these operations so dangerous and effective. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.